There'll be a lot of additional announcements at the 10 o'clock hour and at the close of our service, so I'm not going to go into those. We will turn our attention to our study. We began last quarter a study on apologetics, or Christian evidences, reasons for our faith, and we introduced that study with 1 Peter 3:15 and the call from the Apostle Peter to Christians. We are to sanctify the Lord God in our hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks a reason of the hope that is in us, and that we should make that defense with kindness and with respect to those we're trying to reach. We cannot beat the truth into anyone, nor would we want to. We cannot compel anyone to be a believer, but we believe that there is adequate evidence to support faith not only in the existence of God, but in the inspiration of the Bible, the deity of Jesus, and we need to be aware of that information and prepare ourselves to share it. I had intended to bring a book with me to class this morning. I just remembered the book is It Couldn't Just Happen, and it is in print, and I would encourage young parents in particular, this would be an excellent book to have when your children start asking questions about God's creation and various aspects of it. And if you'd like a copy of it, I know that you can get it. If you'd like to look at it first, there should be a copy in the church library, and there's one in my library that I'd certainly be happy to share with you. I know it's something that we got when we were raising kids, and something that we gave to both of our children so that they would have it as a resource as well. The text of Genesis 1:1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Let's turn now to John chapter 1 very quickly. And I know these are familiar verses, but they seem very appropriate as we look at the creation in terms of our response to answer questions. John wrote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And one final passage very quickly from Hebrews 11, because they all relate to creation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Those three passages, and there are others that we could highlight, all underscore the creative work of God. They tell us that essentially out of nothing, God made everything, that the things we see around us were made from things that we do not see. From the invisible, God made the visible. Now, there is a sense in which physics concurs with that conclusion. Whether physics concurred or not would really not be that essential, because, again, we believe this is God's book, and God has revealed his will accurately, and we would accept what God says over anything that physicists, scientists, or others might argue without evidence that is contrary to this book, because the record really does stand for itself. It has been 3,600 years since Moses under the direction of God, penned the first 5 books of the Bible. It has been nearly 2,000 years since the pen of inspiration was put aside when John concluded Revelation, and in all of that time, nothing has ever been discovered that makes us suspect of anything this book reveals. That says a lot about the book in and of itself. So we accept what the record asserts regarding creation. And when you look at the narrative, as we have just done in Genesis 1, we begin with space and matter, heavens and the earth. Space, the heavens, is used in the Word of God in 3 ways. You may recall the Apostle Paul in his second letter to the church at Corinth, speaking of someone that he knew caught up into the 3rd heaven. And in the first century, those who read that would have no difficulty understanding what he meant. The first heaven is where the birds fly. The second heaven, the sun, the moon, and the stars reside. And the 3rd heaven, that's the seat of God's throne. That's his place, so to speak. And Paul, in his letter to the church at Corinth, said, I don't know whether in the body or out of the body, but this one was caught up into the 3rd heaven, into the presence of God. And he heard things that he was not permitted to reveal when he returned. But that gives us some idea of what the Bible says about the nature of heaven. Matter is material substance out of which all of the physical world consists. Now, according to the Big Bang explanation for origin, and it's utilized by those who adopt organic evolution as the explanation for everything, all of the matter in the universe was at one point squeezed into a single point without dimension and without explanation. There was an explosion, and out of that explosion, everything we see came to be. They don't know where all this stuff that got squeezed into this single point without dimension came from. They don't have any clue about why it exploded, what or who caused that explosion. They just say, this is the way it was. You need to accept it and move on. We've outgrown God. We've outgrown our need for faith. We can explain everything by the laws of physics, but they can't explain where those laws originated. And most of us would, I think, argue that when you have indication of order and you have demonstrations of design and you have actions which occur, we would say there has to be a cause or causes, that the design demonstrates a designer, and if something exists, how did it come into existence? Now, our narrative from the 3 passages that we shared, and again, there are many, many more that talk about creation in Scripture, but these 3 simply assert God did it, and he did it by speaking it into existence. And that is the fullest demonstration of power that, in my judgment, we can witness. You see it in a much smaller scale in the story in Mark 4 of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee with the disciples when they are nearly overwhelmed by a storm. The disciples are fearful of death while Jesus sleeps in the back of the boat. They're certain they're going to die, and when they awake him, he simply stands and speaks, "Peace, be still." And the record says the wind ceased and there was a great calm. Well, it's that kind of power that brought everything into existence, and it was the power of God, and from John's gospel, that power working through the person of Jesus Christ. The heavens and the earth, therefore, were created by God, not by accident, not by laws of physics that occur without explanation, but by the Creator God who exists outside of creation, who has always existed and who will always exist. He is not a contingent being. He is not dependent on anyone else. He has always been. He will always be. He brought the world into existence. Now, today, and I think for some time now, the argument has been made that this is really just myth. That at best, Genesis is a creation myth, perhaps an example of ancient poetry, a desire to explain the unexplained or to express the incomprehensible. I believe it's historical narrative, that this is how it happened, and God did it. Now, the details are not given, and so where God is silent, we can't speak with certainty. And it's all right to contemplate. You can, if you choose, try to work through the processes in your own mind and dig deeper into the recesses of your abilities, and perhaps you might come to some conclusions. But the fact of the matter is, the record simply asserts that God did it, and we accept that and move on in our faith. Now, I began by telling you no writer of the Bible in either testament ever set out to prove the existence of God. I don't know if you remember me saying that or not, but it is true. There are 66 books in the Bible. Not one of them was written to bring us to an understanding of the existence of God based on unassailable evidence. But having said that, it is wrong to reach the conclusion that there is no evidence for faith. Faith, in fact, rests on an unshakable foundation of evidence, and it takes far more faith to reject the biblical explanation of origin than to accept what the Scriptures say. So, as we begin to look at evidence this morning, we assert once more that faith is not a blind leap in the dark. In one of Samuel Clemens' book, Mark Twain's books, one of his characters said, in essence, faith is believing that which there ain't no evidence to support. And a lot of people think that's true of faith. But remember, Clemens wrote fiction, and that's not true. There is evidence to support our faith, and it's not the empirical evidence that many people want, seeing it with their own eyes, hearing with their own ears, touching with their own hands kind of thing. But I would submit to you that most of what we know and believe today does not come through empirical evidence. It comes through other kinds of evidence that are just as valid. Most of history is based on the kind of evidence that comes through the testimony of others. We have a fairly good understanding, I think, of our founding fathers and some of the things they did. We know, for instance, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who was involved in our Constitution, who our first president was. We don't know any of that through empirical evidence. We learn it because the facts have been handed down from generation to generation. That's valid, and much of what we know about God comes by that same means. It's correctly argued that, therefore, we can't give empirical, that is, originating or based on observation or experiment or experience, capable of being verified, demonstrated, or disproved by observation. Now, we can demonstrate that water boils at a certain temperature by boiling water, can't we? Put a thermometer in it. At what point it begins to boil, that's the temperature that boils water. And at sea level, it's what? 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, it differs at various altitudes, but we're able to demonstrate that empirically. We know that water boils at a certain temperature because it has been demonstrated scientifically and repeatedly. We can't know of God's existence in the same way. Some people would argue that that's not the case. If God really existed, we ought to be able to demonstrate that. The old story of the critic, the atheist who is attacking faith, standing before a group of people and saying, I can prove to you that there is no God. And he looks up and says, God, if you are up there, strike me with lightning right now. And obviously nothing happened. And a moment later, he turns to the audience and says, see, I told you, there is no God. But what has he demonstrated? Nothing other than his own lack of understanding. Do you think God's going to take orders from him? He doesn't work that way. There's nothing to indicate in Scripture that he does for ordinary people. And when we do have demonstrations of that kind of power, they're extraordinary, not ordinary. But to say that you can't prove God's existence empirically is not to say that we can't give valid reasons why one would choose to believe. And yet most of us, if we were called to lay down the reasons that brought us here today, that dictate how we conduct our lives daily, how we interact with people, and the hope that we have in our hearts of life beyond this life, would probably say, well, that's just what I've always been taught, or that's what my parents believed and what their parents believed, or that's the accepted norm in my social circles. And all of that may be true, but that really doesn't prove anything. If we're going to give an answer, we need to know the basis of our faith in arguments that really do sustain the fact that God created. Let's begin, I think, from the weaker and work to the stronger arguments that support our faith in God at this time. We begin with Augustine's intuitional argument. And the essence of this argument is that people are just religious. All over this globe, and this has been true throughout recorded history, every civilization that has ever been discovered has been a religious civilization. Now, it's true that religions differed, that concepts varied, but the fact is, people are religious. They're looking for something higher than themselves. Why is that? Where did this concept of God originate? And Augustine's argument is from the Creator. There is a divine spark in all of us so that we are instinctively religious. And he makes a valid point. We would come to realize there is something greater than self without this book. Remember, we're going to talk a little later about the cosmological argument, which declares the heavens are proof of God's existence. People have always stood and gazed into the heavens in awe. Do we need to kill a wasp over there? Well, I tell you what, if Dad was worth his salt, he'd already have that taken care of, Mindy. I can't believe that he doesn't get that thing for you. If I have to, I'll come down and get it. Is he over here now, Ed? If John puts this on the internet, I know all of our sermons are on the internet. Now, I don't know if the classes are or not, but if you're listening somewhere in the world, We have a wasp problem right now, but it's going to be addressed. People look into the heavens and they conclude there has to be something higher, mightier than me. And that's what Augustine was saying. Then there is the moral argument expressed by Immanuel Kant. He wrote, "Two things fill the mind with admiration and awe, the starry heavens above and the moral law within." Oh, I see him now. Is that what's going on? Okay. He comes back, I'll grab him. The moral law within. Now, I just told you that Augustine says everybody's religious, and that's due to our origin, a creator. Now, there is this understanding, secondly, of people universally again. There's right and wrong, there's good and evil, there are things we should do, and there are also things that we shouldn't do. Where'd this come from? Why is it universally understood that it's wrong to kill somebody? Why shouldn't you murder? Why is it universally understood that you should not take someone else's property? I don't know of any society where thievery is held up as a worthy pursuit. It's just understood that this is not right. And so the moral law argument says we all understand good and evil, right and wrong. Why? And the answer is it is part of our DNA, so to speak. The Creator created us with a recognition that there's something higher than self, and there is a law that governs that is universally understood, the difference between right and wrong. It's all about the argument for man's conscience. You just instinctively know certain things. You have a moral urge. You don't always fulfill it, but it is there. And that's why when you do things that are morally wrong, your conscience bothers you. God made us that way. Paul referred to this, by the way, in Romans 2:14 and 15, an inner sense of right and wrong, which we all have and attribute to the Creator. Romans 2:14 and 15 reads, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." Now, when you begin to read Romans chapter 2 and follow through to chapter 3, you find Paul asking the question, what advantage do the Jews have? And he says much in every way, because unto them was given the law, the written law, the law of Moses, the Bible, Old Testament, as we call it today. That gave them a leg up, so to speak, on everyone else. But everyone else is not left in the dark, for Paul argues that even the Gentiles had a law written on their hearts, so to speak, imprint of God, if you please, that enabled them to know right from wrong in the broad sense of what we should or should not do, and to convict them when they didn't follow that and fill their hearts with guilt. Now, when you get to the 14th chapter of Romans, he says, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. And he's talking about doing things that we know we shouldn't do, and that constitutes sin in our lives. You don't have to have a written law in most cases to know those things. The written law dealt primarily with just keeping the descendants of Abraham unique as those descendants until the arrival of Christ. The basic laws of humanity and right and wrong and how to treat people, they're indelibly imprinted on our hearts. They're part of our consciousness. And this argument says that we, because of this, have proof that God exists. C.S. Lewis, who was not originally a believer but became perhaps one of the best apologists for the faith that the last century knew, wrote in his book Mere Christianity 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave in that way. And for him, this was a profound insight that led him, along with other arguments, to conclude that we're not the product of accident, that Darwin just got it wrong, that you cannot explain man's religious nature nor his sense of good and evil, right and wrong, apart from the Creator. And I have yet to find anything that would cause me to question the accuracy of those arguments. We are inherently religious, and we have built within us a realization that there's good and evil, right and wrong. You can't explain that with biology, chemistry, or physics. But you explain it with an acknowledgement of the existence of God. The ontological argument. This is the argument from the concept of God to the existence of God. It depends on the distinction between existence in mind and existence in reality. And I realize that may be somewhat technical. You may be thinking, what in the world does that mean? The second argument is from concept of God to his necessary existence. If you can conceive of God, that implies that God must exist. And Anselm, in his work called the Proslogium, made this argument. I think it's probably the weakest of all of the arguments, but for some it is considered quite effective. The essence of the argument says that the statement, God does not exist, is self-contradictory, since the very concept of God entails his existence. The fact that you can deny his existence, he argues, proves his existence, because there's something that causes you to think about him and his non-existence. And that would be the fact that he does exist. Existence is part of the very definition of God. Therefore, saying God does not exist is like saying husbands are not married. Now, we understand husbands are not married is clearly a false statement, because we cannot be a husband if we are not married. And the argument that Anselm makes is, when you say God does not exist, you can't deny his existence unless he does exist. So he must exist. And again, for some people, that's a weighty argument. For me, I think that's probably the weakest of all. But it's one that's used. The next argument is called the cosmological argument. And this is the argument that is used in Psalm 19:1 and through 3. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament, that's the sky, if you're wondering, shows or demonstrates his handiwork. And he goes on to say that this is universally true anywhere in the world. You can observe the beauty and nature of creation and conclude that it didn't happen accidentally. That's a valid argument, I think an unassailable argument, but it does not declare for certain what God, whose God, or gods. It only declares that this could not have come about accidentally. We're able to declare today that it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because the Creator did not leave us in the dark as to His creation. He gave us a written narrative, a manual, an instruction manual for life, and in it we discover that the heavens are declaring the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the Creator of the universe and of man himself. But when you look at the cosmological argument, it does underscore the fact that we could not have happened accidentally, that the effects we see demand an explanation through a cause or causes. This is also what the Hebrews writer was driving home in Hebrews 3, verse 4. He wrote, "Every house is built by some man." Now, that's unassailable. Nobody that I know would argue that that's not true. And I'm not even concerned about how elaborate a house would be. Look at a bird's nest. That's a bird's house, is it not? You see a bird's nest, what do you absolutely know? Bird. The bird or birds built the nest. Now, if you really is an ornithologist, that is an expert in birds, you can see the nest and identify the nest builder. I'm not that kind of person. But there are some people who study these things. In fact, they have, as I have told you before, even come to the conclusion that there are 100 billion birds in our world. There are 7.5 billion people. There are 100 billion birds. Now, how they got that number, I don't know. I'm just reporting what they have said. And there are people who can identify these birds and their nest and their eggs and a whole host of other things. There are people who actually collect bird eggs. And some are quite expensive and illegal to possess. So a lot has gone into that kind of thing. But all I'm interested in is the nest indicates the nest builder. The house demands a house builder. With one exception, the universe, Earth, and everything we see in it, that happened accidentally through an explosion we can't explain. I like the illustrations that I've heard, accepting the Big Bang as the explanation for origin is like turning to Webster's Collegiate Dictionary and explaining it as the explosion in a print factory. Or going to a manufacturing factory and saying that a 747 is the result of an explosion in a manufacturing factory. Now, nobody would ever buy those kinds of explanations because they're ludicrous. But the universe, and compared to those kinds of things, is so much vaster, grander, more complicated, more intricate, and it just happened by explosion. The cosmological argument says no. The universe demonstrates the existence of the Creator because for every effect there is a corresponding cause or causes. The cosmological argument, by the way, comes in a number of different forms. The Thomist argument, the Leibnizian argument, the Kalam argument. This is one that was developed in the Arab world that is, in my judgment, easily understood and very effective. The argument demands a first cause which was uncaused. God. We've said already that God is not a contingent being. He is not dependent on anyone or anything else. He is the uncaused cause of everything. To ask where God came from is to deny the very definition of God, who is eternal. The Thomas argument. This argument received its name from St. Thomas Aquinas, for those of you who would like to do additional research, 13th century A.D. It begins by exerting the existence of finite contingent beings. And we talked several weeks ago about finite and infinite beings and finite and infinite classes. And that comes into play with this argument to a degree. These would be beings which could have not existed and thus are dependent for their being on something else. Finite beings owe their current existence either to an infinite regress of other dependent beings. Remember, we talked a little bit about infinite regress. I'm here today because of Harold and Patricia. But I would not be here today if Harold and Patricia had not known Frank and Opal and Henry and Myrtle. That's my grandparents. They had parents, and their parents had parents, and their parents had parents, and it goes back, 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 but it cannot go back infinitely. That's infinite regress, because if it went back infinitely, none of us would be here. There had to be a start, a beginning. Guess what? In the beginning, which is absolutely necessary, there had to be an infinite creator outside of creation, an uncaused cause who brought it all about. Infinite regress does not account for existence. There has to be a necessary being, one which could not cease to exist if it does in fact have existence. We call that infinite being, who does exist and has existed infinitely, God. And that's the only viable explanation we can offer for origin that satisfies the very simple statement, every house is built by some man, but he that built all things is God. For every effect, there is a corresponding cause or causes. The Leibnizian argument receives its name from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Guess what? I think he was German. It begins by asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why? Why does anything exist at all? It then uses the principle of sufficient cause or reason. For anything that exists, there must be some reason, some purpose, or rational context why it exists rather than it does not exist. To argue for the existence of an intrinsically intelligible, self-explanatory being, God, whose existence is logically necessary. So, there's stuff out there. Why does that stuff exist? It had to be brought into existence. There had to be a cause. And this argument is that the only explanation is God. It's still the only explanation. The Kalam argument from the Arab world gets its name from the Arab word, which refers to philosophy or theology. This argument presents a number of dilemmas. The first argument states that the universe is either a universe that had a beginning or it did not have a beginning. And then you have to ask, if it had a beginning, then the beginning was either caused or uncaused. Which was it? And if it was caused, was that cause personal or was it impersonal? And the answers to the questions that are raised by the argument are fairly easily ascertained. Well, I skipped over that illustration, didn't I? There it is. You start with the universe. Everybody admits there is a universe. We're part of it. We see it when we look at the moon, the stars. If you're foolish enough, you look at the sun. That's our universe. Well, did it have a beginning or has it always existed? Even those who are in fields of science and physics and seek explanations for origins and existence, all now today admit there was a beginning. So the answer to that one seems pretty obvious. There was a beginning. According to the evolutionists, 14.5 to 16 billion years ago for this world. But there was a beginning. Now, was this building caused or not caused, this beginning, pardon me? Well, what do you think? Everything we see demonstrates the need for something to bring that thing into existence, to cause it. Do you believe that it is more reasonable and logical to acknowledge a universe that had a beginning that was caused or uncaused? You know, every time you hear about a fire, what's the first thing that people want to know after was anybody killed? What started it? What caused it? Fires do not just happen. They are caused. Something occurs that produces the fire. So we would argue there must be a cause. Now, was this cause personal or impersonal? And when you think about the nature of the universe, how intricate, how detailed, how important it is that everything be just perfect in order for life as we know it to exist, is it reasonable to say that it was a personal or an unpersonal cause? And the answer is obvious. A personal cause brought the universe into existence. That personal force was God. Thus, the force of the cosmological argument. And then we have the teleological argument. I'll touch on it because there are even more varieties of this. There are so many types of design, and we're going to try to quickly acknowledge all of those starting next week. The psalmist said, "I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, and that my soul knows right well." He's talking about his own body. And he says, as he looks to God, "I will praise you for the way you made me." Think about the nature of the human body today. How well designed it is. Could it have happened accidentally? And again, the answer is no, given the evidence that is available. "O Lord, our Lord," the psalmist wrote, "how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. When I look at the heavens, the sun, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is man that you're mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him?" God made us in a marvelous way, and he didn't walk away, abandon us. He made possible our every need to be satisfied. And when we look at the nature of what he made, we have to assume that we're not a product of accident. There is too much evidence of design for that to be the case. Now, this is where we're going to pick up our study next week. And I'll just give you a taste of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at design of order, design of purpose, of simplicity, complexity, beauty, sense and cognition, information, and the cosmic constants, all demonstrating that we could not have happened